Chapter 1. The Burden of Nobility. The vaulted halls of my father's castle reverberated with the sounds of revelry, laughter, the clatter of goblets, the scrape of silver on pewter. My place at the head of the feast should have been one of honor, but the heavy oak chair felt like a prison. The weight of expectation hung over me like the iron chandeliers above the hall, festooned with waxen tears from 100 candles. I watched my father, Lord Adrian von Hohenstall, bask in the admiration of our guests. A mountain of a man, clad in a breastplate polished to a mirror sheen, he seemed to embody everything a noble should be, stern, unyielding, and endlessly capable. My brothers and sisters, each more at ease than I, entertained merchants and minor lords with effortless grace. Their voices blended with the music, a tapestry of charm and diplomacy. And then there was me, Parzival, the youngest and least remarkable of the von Hohenstall line. The idealistic dreamer, the one my tutors scolded for asking why rather than how. My role tonight was to nod politely, smile when spoken to, and ensure the wine flowed freely. I looked down at my plate, a spread of delicacies brought from across the empire, pheasant glazed with honey, river trout stuffed with herbs, golden baked bread still steaming. It tasted of ash in my mouth. Outside these walls, I knew, the peasants would feast only on scraps. The thought turned my stomach. The conversation turned to war, as it always did. Tales of battles against orcs, beastmen, and worse filled the hall, punctuated by exaggerated boasts and hearty laughter. My uncle bragged about cutting down a dozen raiders in a single charge. My cousin regaled the table with his harrowing escape from a chaos warband. Yet none of it stirred me. The old world was aflame, and here we sat, cocooned in wealth and tradition, toasting to the empire's glory. I drained my goblet and forced myself to listen as a guest. A scholar draped in threadbare robes spoke of ancient bloodlines and darker matters. "Your family's history is as storied as the empire itself," the man said, his voice low and deliberate. He gestured toward my father, his ink-stained fingers trembling slightly. "But the von Hohenstalls are not without complications." My father frowned but said nothing, waving for the scholar to continue. The room fell still, the clamor of knives and conversation fading into uneasy silence. "It is said," the scholar continued, his voice now barely above a whisper, "that your line carries more than noble blood. A shadow follows your house, a debt yet unpaid. And this is better news for us in Kairos. I have been researching." A chill crept up my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, breaking the heavy quiet. The scholar's gaze shifted to me, his hollow eyes unreadable. "Some truths are better left undisturbed, young lord." His words lingered like smoke, curling into my thoughts and refusing to dissipate. My father dismissed the scholar with a curt gesture, his face a mask of irritation. But I couldn't let it go. A shadow? A debt? I had always felt like an outsider in my own family, but this made me feel as though I didn't even belong to myself. Later that night, long after the guests had retired and the torches in the hall had burned low, I stood in my chambers and gazed out at the lands that stretched beyond the castle walls. The moon bathed the fields and forests in silver, but in the distance, storm clouds brooded over the horizon. The scholar's words gnawed at me. If there was a shadow in our bloodline, I needed to understand it. If my purpose was buried in secrets, I had to uncover them. My father would never approve. My siblings would laugh at the thought, but they didn't feel the same restless yearning I did. I wasn't like them. Slipping into a plain tunic and cloak, I buckled my sword belt, a ceremonial blade that had never tasted battle, and gathered a small satchel of provisions. I paused at the threshold of my chambers, my heart racing. Beyond this door lay uncertainty, danger, and truths that could unmake everything I knew. Before I got the words out, I felt something slam into my back. I looked up and saw the blow, but I didn't get a good look. Chapter 2. Into the Wastes. The air was colder here, sharper. Each breath stung as I trudged along the muddy road leading away from the only life I had ever known. The forests of the von Hohenstahl estate were long behind me, replaced by a barren expanse of scrubland and twisted trees clawing at a stormy sky. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, its cry echoing like a dirge for those who dared tread these forsaken paths. This was the old world I had always heard about in stories, harsh, unforgiving, and alive with menace. The land bore scars of battles fought long before my birth, and the people I passed seemed no less broken. Haggard peasants huddled in the ruins of farmhouses, their hollow eyes darting to me as I walked by. I tried to offer what little coin I had, but most waved me off, or shrank away, muttering prayers to Signor. The road stretched on endlessly, its monotony broken only by the occasional signpost, weathered and illegible. I pressed forward, clutching the hilt of my sword for reassurance, though I doubted it would be of much use should trouble find me. And trouble did not take long. Purda smiled at the two of us with a warm and happy face. It began with the smell, coppery and rank. I halted mid-step, the wind carrying a faint but unmistakable stench of blood. The air seemed to thicken, and a low growl rumbled through the trees ahead. My hand instinctively moved to my sword as shadows slithered in the underbrush. It came suddenly, like predators pouncing on wounded prey. Beast-men. Twisted mockeries of man and beast, their horns gleaming in the dim light as they bounded toward me with guttural roars. My heart thundered in my chest, but my legs refused to move. Fear rooted me in place as the first of them lunged, its rusted axe raised high. A flash of steel and a spray of blood. The beast-man toppled to the ground, its neck split wide. I blinked, barely registering the man who now stood between me and death. I stared momentarily abashed at the suffering beast-man, at the screams of pain, shrieks of pain, and "No!" he barked, shoving me backward, as two more beastmen charged. The stranger was a wiry man with a wild mane of graying hair, his leather armor patched and stained from countless battles. He moved with the brutal efficiency of someone who had spent his life fighting for survival, his sword carving through the attackers with practiced ease. "On your feet, lad," he snapped, as the last beastman fell, twitching. "If you're going to wander the wastes, you'd best learn to fight." Staggered upright, still clutching my sword. He grunted, cleaning his blade on the grass. "Don't thank me yet. These woods are crawling with worse things than those brutes. What's a pup like you doing out here anyway?" My voice faltered. How could I explain my quest to this hardened stranger without sounding like a fool? "I'm searching for answers." Renee's observation was directed and kind. I lied. He gave me a sidelong glance, his expression a mix of curiosity and disdain. "Answers won't do you much good when you're dead." His name was Elias, a mercenary by trade and a cynic by nature. He agreed to let me travel with him, not out of charity, he assured me, but because he figured I wouldn't last a day on my own. I didn't argue. We walked in silence for a time, the road winding through desolate hills. The sky grew darker, heavy with clouds that churned like a cauldron. Elias spoke little, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon, but I could feel his judgment. He saw me for what I was, a naive noble playing at adventure. "You got no business being out here," he said at last, his tone cutting. "The wastes aren't kind to dreamers." "I'm not dreaming," I said, bristling. "There's something I need to find. Something about my family." Elias stopped, turning to face me. "Let me guess. Some long-lost treasure? A buried secret that'll make everything clear?" He snorted. "You think you're the first noble brat to go chasing ghosts? The only thing waiting at the end of that road is disappointment. Or worse." "I have to know," I insisted, meeting his gaze. "If there's even a chance. I can't go back without the truth." Elias studied me for a moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he sighed and started walking again. "Fine," he muttered, "but don't say I didn't warn you." "So maybe we have some pretty pricey hodzes of our own," I said. "Does the boy have the means then?" As the day wore on, Elias proved himself an invaluable guide. He knew which paths to avoid, where to find shelter, and how to read the signs of danger in the landscape. He taught me how to move quietly, how to listen for the unnatural sounds that signaled something watching us. But even with his expertise, the road ahead seemed impossibly daunting. He spoke of a distant city, one that might hold the answers I sought. A crumbling relic from a bygone age, where ancient records were said to be kept. It was a slim lead, but it was all I had. "You're playing a dangerous game, lad," Elias said as we made camp that night. "You start poking around in the past, and you'll find things better left buried." "I'm not afraid of the truth," I replied, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. Elias chuckled darkly. "You should be. Out here, truth and fate are the same thing, and neither one's ever kind." I stared into the fire, the shadows dancing on my face. Despite his warnings, I felt a strange sense of determination, as if the very act of setting out on this journey had already changed something in me. The road ahead was fraught with peril, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't turn back now. Chapter 3. The Library of Ashes. The city of Scarhollow stood like a corpse on the edge of a desolate plain. Its walls, once a proud testament to imperial might, crumbled under the weight of years and neglect. Blackened by fire and streaked with grime, the stones bore the scars of countless sieges. As Elias and I passed through the shattered gates, I couldn't help but feel we were stepping into a mausoleum rather than a settlement. As a result of Holly's first foray, inside the streets were a labyrinth of ruin and decay. Thin figures scurried like rats in the shadows, their faces gaunt with hunger and distrust. The few merchants still brave enough to trade here hawked wares from dilapidated stalls, their goods a motley collection of scavenged relics and spoiled food. The air reeked of rot and despair. "This place is cursed," Elias muttered, gripping the hilt of his sword as his eyes darted from alley to alley. "We shouldn't linger." Alex looked around for an opportunity to leave, but I had no intention of turning back. Somewhere within this wretched city lay the Library of Ashes, a repository of ancient knowledge, rumored to hold records that could illuminate the secrets of my family's past. It was a desperate hope, but it was all I had. We found the library in the heart of the city, a hulking edifice of black stone that seemed to absorb the weak sunlight. Its doors were adorned with the sigil of Verena, goddess of wisdom and justice, though the image was so worn it was barely recognizable. A pair of stern-faced zealots stood guard, their armor dented but their weapons sharp. "State your business," one of them barked, his voice muffled by the iron mask he wore. I seek knowledge, I replied, standing as tall as I could under their scrutinizing gaze. The god exchanged a glance with his companion before stepping aside. Enter. But know this, the price of knowledge is steep. Inside, the Library of Ashes lived up to its name. The air was thick with soot, and the shelves sagged under the weight of ancient tomes, many of them charred or crumbling. Dust hung in the dim light, and the faint scent of decay lingered in every corner. The sound of my boots on the cracked stone floor echoed ominously. Elias followed close behind, his hand never straying far from his sword. "This place feels wrong," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the creaking of the building. "Be quick about it." We were greeted by the head librarian, a gaunt man with sunken eyes and a serpentine smile. He introduced himself as Keeper Orlan, his robes an indigo so dark it seemed almost black. His voice was soft and inviting, yet it carried an undertone that set my teeth on edge. "You come seeking truth," Orlan said, his gaze piercing. "Few have the courage to do so. Fewer still survive the burden it brings." "I need to know about the von Hohenstall bloodline," I said, steeling myself against the man's unsettling demeanor. "The truth of my family's past." Orlan's smile widened. "Ah, the truth. A rare and dangerous commodity." He gestured for me to follow. "Come, let us see what the ashes can reveal." For hours, I pored over fragile manuscripts and half-burned ledgers under Orlan's watchful eye. The records were incomplete, riddled with gaps where time or flame had devoured the words. But piece by piece, a picture began to emerge. An ancestor of mine, Baron Eltar von Hohenstall, had been implicated in a catastrophic event centuries ago. The accounts were vague, but they spoke of strange rites and forbidden knowledge. Entire villages had vanished under his rule, their fates shrouded in mystery. One record hinted at a pact struck in desperation, a bargain with forces no mortal should ever see. I froze as I read a single damning line. "The blood of the von Hohenstall line is forever marked. A shadow bound to the ruinous powers." My vision swam, the weight of the words pressing down on me like a physical force. I felt Elias's hand on my shoulder, grounding me. "Easy, lad," he said, his voice unusually soft. "Whatever this is, it doesn't define you." But before I could reply, Orlan stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You've uncovered much," he said, his voice like silk. "But there is more to know." I hesitated, the air around us suddenly feeling colder. "What do you mean?" Orlan's smile twisted into something darker. "The taint in your bloodline runs deeper than you realize. It is not merely a shadow of the past. It is a living thing, a mark that binds you to the great architect." Elias drew his sword in an instant, pointing it at the librarian. "What are you playing at, old man?" Orlan laughed, a sound that echoed unnaturally in the cavernous space. "Do you think the pursuit of knowledge is without risk? The truth, young lord, is that your family's destiny was sealed long ago. The ruinous powers watch you, even now." His robes shifted, revealing the mark of Tzeentch branded into his flesh. The zealot guards outside had not been guardians of Verena. They were puppets of chaos, just as Orlan was. Elias moved to strike, but Orlan raised a hand, and a wave of unnatural force sent us sprawling. "Fools," he sneered. "You cannot escape what you are." I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding. "I am not my bloodline," I shouted, the words echoing in the darkness. Orlan's laughter faded into the distance as he disappeared into the shadows. The building trembled, as if the very walls rejected his presence, and the distant sound of the guards closing in spurred us into motion. We fled the library, the echoes of Orlan's laughter ringing in my ears. Outside, the storm had broken, rain pelting the shattered streets as we ran. My mind raced with questions, but one truth stood out above all others. The storm and being in love with Mistress were not the same thing. If my bloodline was marked by chaos, then I had to find a way to sever that bond, no matter the cost. Chapter 4. Shadows in the Blood. The storm lashed at us as we stumbled through the ruined streets of Scar Hollow, every shadow seeming to writhe with unseen malice. Behind us, the distant shouts of Orlan's zealots echoed through the rain-soaked alleys, their voices filled with unholy fervor. Elias led the way, his sword gleaming even in the dim light as he carved a path through the chaos. "Keep moving," he barked over his shoulder. "If they catch us, you'll wish the library had collapsed on top of us." My legs burned with the effort of running, my lungs screaming for air. The scrolls and fragments I had taken from the Library of Ashes were tucked tightly under my cloak, their weight far heavier than mere paper. Each word I had read haunted me, whispering doubt into the cracks of my resolve. Was I truly marked? Did the blood of chaos flow in my veins? Ahead, Elias skidded to a halt at the edge of a collapsed bridge, the chasm below swallowing the road. He swore under his breath, scanning for another route. With a shriek of pain, the vehicle tilted forward, sending him forward on it backward. Behind us, the shouts grew louder. "No time for second thoughts," I called, my voice trembling. I sprinted forward and leapt, my boots barely catching the edge of the opposite bank. I turned just in time to see Elias follow, landing beside me with a grunt. We scrambled into the wilderness beyond the city, the ruins fading into the mist behind us. The cultists didn't follow immediately. Perhaps they feared the forest as much as we did. But the thought brought me little comfort. By nightfall, we had found shelter beneath an overhanging cliff, the fire Elias managed to coax to life, casting flickering shadows on the jagged rock. Rainwater dripped from my hair and pooled at my feet, but I barely noticed. My mind was consumed by the librarian's words. "The taint in your bloodline runs deeper than you realize." "You're quiet," Elias said, his tone uncharacteristically soft as he sat across from me. "Ah, too quiet." I looked up from the flames, meeting his weary gaze. "What if it's true?" I asked. "What if I'm tainted? What if this mark isn't just a shadow of the past, but something inside me?" Elias leaned back against the rock, his face grim. "If you were, we'd know by now. Chaos has a way of showing itself. Mutations, madness, worse. You seem fine to me. For now, stay here."
His words didn't bring the comfort he intended. But what if it's only a matter of time? I pressed. What if my quest for answers just brings the corruption closer?
Elias sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubble. "I've been around long enough to know this. Fate's a cruel mistress, but she's not all-powerful. You get a say in who you are. Don't let some charlatan librarian convince you otherwise." Despite his bluntness, his words kindled a small spark of hope in me. I wasn't ready to abandon my journey, not yet. But I needed guidance. I needed clarity. And I knew where to find it. The Monastery of St. Craven lay 3 days' travel to the south, perched on a jagged cliff overlooking the river below. It was once a stronghold of Sigmarite inquisitors, known for rooting out chaos taint with unyielding zeal. Though abandoned now, whispers of its forbidden archives lingered among those who dared speak of such things. If anyone had recorded the truths of my family's bloodline, it would be there. Our journey toward the monastery was fraught with peril. The wilderness beyond Scar Hollow was a realm forgotten by civilization, where only the desperate or depraved ventured. The sky seemed perpetually overcast, casting a pall over the gnarled trees and marshy ground. Every sound, a snapped twig, the cry of a distant bird, put us on edge. It was on the second day that we heard the screams. The caravan was in chaos by the time we reached it, the clash of steel and the cries of the wounded ringing out over the riverbank. A group of Sigmarite pilgrims, mostly women and children, were under attack by Norscan raiders, their savage war cries cutting through the air like blades. The pilgrims, armed with little more than farming tools, fought valiantly, but they were no match for the marauders. Roasted Man quickly scrambled over the wall and fired his pistol at the maddened animals. Elias didn't hesitate. He drew his blade and charged into the fray, cutting down the first raider he reached with a precision that spoke of years of battle. I followed, though my hands trembled as I unsheathed my sword. This was no practiced bout, no sparring match with my brothers. This was death, raw and unrelenting. A Norscan warrior spotted me, his face painted with cruel runes, his axe raised high. Instinct took over. I parried his strike, the force of the blow nearly knocking the sword from my hands. Fear surged through me, but so did something else, a fierce determination, a refusal to let these people die while I stood idle. My next strike caught the raider in the side, and he fell with a gurgling cry. I stared at his lifeless body, my chest heaving, the world around me a blur. I had killed. The realization left me both hollow and strangely resolute. After a few strangled seconds, I stood up and swore aloud. I screamed into the jaws of death. Elias's voice snapped me back to the present. "Focus, lad. There's more of them." The battle raged on, but the tide began to turn. With Elias leading the charge and the pilgrims rallying behind us, the remaining raiders fled, their cries of fury fading into the distance. Climb forward. Climb forward. Afterward, the survivors gathered around a makeshift fire, their faces pale and drawn. They thanked us profusely, though their gratitude felt undeserved. The blood on my hands was still fresh, the weight of what I had done pressing down on me like a stone. "Still not been beaten yet, was it?" Nathaniel asked Allison.
Elias sat beside me, his own face unreadable. "You did what you had to," he said quietly. "Don't dwell on it."
But I couldn't help it. The violence I had witnessed, the desperation of the pilgrims, the cruelty of the raiders, it was the old world laid bare. And I couldn't shake the nagging thought that the darkness I fought against might also live within me.
As the pilgrims huddled together, whispering prayers to Sigmar, I looked toward the horizon. The monastery awaited, its shadow looming large in my mind. Whatever answers it held, I would face them. I had to. "I think it'll be okay," Erity said through closed eyes.
Chapter 5. The Templar's Warning. The monastery loomed before us like a ghost from another age. Its crumbling towers reached toward the gray sky, their jagged peaks framed by vines that had long since claimed the stone. Once, this place must have been a bastion of faith and strength, a beacon against the darkness of the old world. Now it was little more than a husk, its glory buried beneath centuries of decay. Deep inside, Elias and I approached cautiously, our footsteps crunching over broken cobblestones. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and rot, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the hollow halls. "This place doesn't feel right," Elias muttered, his hand on the hilt of his sword. "Like something's watching us." I couldn't argue. Every shadow seemed alive, and the weight of the monastery's history pressed down on me with every step. But I couldn't turn back. Somewhere within these ruined walls lay the answers I sought, and perhaps the salvation I desperately needed. We found him in the old chapel, slumped beneath a shattered stained-glass window that once depicted Sigmar's triumph over chaos. Brother Malric was a shadow of a man, his once proud armor tarnished and dented, his robes tattered and caked with grime. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and rimmed with exhaustion. He clutched a rusted hammer in one trembling hand, the weapon more symbol than tool. Now, at first I thought him dead, but as we stepped closer, his eyes flicked open, their pale blue depths filled with a flicker of recognition. "Who are you?" he rasped, his voice cracked and dry. I knelt beside him, speaking gently. "My name is Parzival. This is Elias. We seek answers about chaos and about bloodlines." Nauric's expression twisted, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "You've come to the wrong place, boy. All that remains here are ghosts and regrets." What the hell had he done to her? The woman was a wine merchant. "God, what's with you?" "Please," I pressed, my voice shaking. "I was told there might be records here. Something that could explain my family's past. I need to know the truth." At that, his gaze sharpened. He studied me for a long moment before shaking his head. "Your blood carries the stain, doesn't it? You feel it, even if you won't admit it." The words struck me like a blow, but I didn't deny them. If it's true, how do I fight it? How do I stop it from consuming me? Malric's bitter laugh echoed in the hollow chamber. "You don't fight it, boy. Not the way you think. The blood doesn't make the man. It's the choices you make that matter. Sigmar himself knew that." But what does it mean?" I demanded. "This stain. Am I destined to fall?" Malric leaned forward, his voice a whisper now, filled with a mix of pity and warning. "The ruinous powers don't just corrupt. They twist, they tempt. They take the darkest part of you and make it sing. But you can resist. You can deny them, as long as you hold to something pure. Like faith." Elias scoffed from behind me, his voice laced with cynicism. "Faith didn't save this place." Malric's eyes flicked to Elias, his expression hardening. "No, it didn't. But it saved me long enough to warn you." Before I could ask more, a low growl echoed through the chapel, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Elias drew his sword, his posture rigid. We're not alone. From the shadows emerged horrors that defied comprehension. Mutated beasts, their flesh a grotesque patchwork of fur, scales, and unnatural growths. Their eyes burned with malevolence, and their mouths twisted into snarls that spoke of hunger and hatred. "Run," Malric whispered, his grip tightening on his hammer. "Run, and don't look back." "Nope." "No," I protested. "You can't fight them alone." Rickety said. His smile returned, softer now. "This is where I belong. Go, boy. Remember what I said. The blood sings in the wastes." Dave immediately felt himself the center of a tremor, his heart pounding and his pulse racing as he fought against the impulse to try and protest his son's absence. Elias grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the exit. "He's right, lad. We can't help him now." As we fled, I glanced back to see Malric rise, his frail form transformed by sheer willpower. He stood tall beneath the shattered window, his hammer raised high as he bellowed a prayer to Sigmar. The beasts surged toward him, But he didn't waver. The last thing I saw before we turned the corner was the hammer's arc, its head glowing with golden light as it struck the first of the abominations. We didn't stop running until the monastery was far behind, its shadow swallowed by the mist. My chest heaved with exhaustion, and my mind raced with Malric's final words. The blood sings in the wastes. What did he mean? Was it a warning or a prophecy? And what lay ahead for me, now that I knew the truth of my bloodline? Ayah placed a hand on my shoulder, his face grim. Don't let his sacrifice be in vain. He believed in you. That's more than most would. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Whatever awaited me in the days to come, I swore to honor Malric's faith in me. I would resist the darkness, no matter the cost. Chapter 6. The Wasteland Beckons. The USDA. The cursed Badlands stretched before us, a vast expanse of cracked earth and jagged ridges. The wind howled through the desolation, carrying with it the faint stench of sulfur and decay. Nothing here was alive, or if it was, it hid well, lurking in the shadows and crevices. Even the sky seemed wrong, its dull gray churned with strange currents of green and purple, as if the heavens themselves recoiled from this forsaken place. Malric's warning echoed in my mind. The blood sings in the wastes. Elias was less convinced. This is madness, he said for the 100th time, his voice tight with frustration. He walked a few paces ahead of me, his sword always in hand, his eyes scanning the horizon. Do you even know where we're going? Or are we just marching into the jaws of whatever monstrosity decides to eat us first? I tightened my grip on the leather strap of my satchel. I don't expect you to understand, Elias. But I have to keep going. I can't stop now. He turned, his weathered face twisted in anger. No, you won't stop. There's a difference. You're chasing ghosts, lad. Ghosts that'll get us both killed. I owe it to Malric. To myself. My voice cracked, but I held firm. You don't have to come with me. There was an edge of grief in his voice. Elias's expression softened, though his frustration didn't fade. You think I'd leave you out here to die alone? No. I'm coming. But don't think for a second I'm happy about it. And we pressed deeper into the wastes, the ground beneath us becoming more unstable with every step. Pools of brackish water dotted the landscape, their surfaces shimmering with unnatural hues. Faint whispers seemed to drift on the wind, just at the edge of hearing. I couldn't tell if they were real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. By the second night, we were both exhausted. Elias started a small fire, more for comfort than warmth. We didn't speak much. There wasn't much left to say. I sat staring into the flames, my thoughts a chaotic tangle of fear, determination, and doubt. That was when we saw her. She appeared on the edge of the firelight, a stooped figure draped in tattered robes that blended with the shadows. Her face was obscured by a hood, but her voice carried the weight of age and wisdom. Strangers in the wastes, she rasped, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. What is it you seek? Elias was on his feet in an instant, his sword leveled at the figure. Stay back, witch, he growled. We've no business with you. Shoot him, please, the woman asked. But I stepped forward, my heart racing. We're looking for answers, I said, my voice trembling. About my bloodline, about a pact made long ago. The witch tilted her head, as if studying me. Then she laughed, a low, hollow sound that sent shivers down my spine. Ah, The blood calls to you, does it? You are of the line of von Hohenstahl. How do you know that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I know many things, she replied, her voice like dry leaves in the wind. I know of your ancestor, the one who bargained with forces beyond mortal comprehension. He sought to protect his lands from ruin, but in doing so, he chained his descendants to a darkness that cannot be undone. Elias muttered a curse, his grip tightening on his sword. More riddles. We don't have time for this, he said, but I stepped closer. Tell me, I said, what did he do? How can I break the bond? The witch raised a gnarled hand, pointing to the east. There is a shrine, she said, ancient and forgotten, where the pact was forged. The truth of your bloodline lies there, but it is not without cost. The shrine's guardian will not yield its secrets easily. What kind of guardian? Elias asked, his tone laced with suspicion. The witch chuckled. One born of the pact itself. To face it is to face the shadow within your soul. Do you have the courage, young von Hohenstahl? I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. The idea of facing such a thing, of facing myself, terrified me. But the thought of turning back, of leaving the truth buried, was worse. I nodded. I'll go. The witch's laughter faded into a soft sigh. Then you may yet find what you seek. But remember this, the blood may sing, but it does not command. The choices you make will decide your fate. By dawn, the witch was gone, as if she had never been there. But her words lingered, heavy and oppressive. As we set out toward the shrine, I felt the weight of Elias's gaze on me. You really believe her? He asked, his voice unusually quiet. I have to, I replied, if there's even a chance she's telling the truth. Elias shook his head, but he said no more. The path ahead was treacherous, the horizon marked by jagged peaks that seemed to claw at the sky. I didn't know what awaited us at the shrine, but I knew this much. Whatever it was, I would face it, because I had to. Chapter 7, The Shrine of Whispers. The plateau rose before us like a jagged scar upon the earth, barren and lifeless, save for the twisted remains of trees that clawed at the sky. At its center stood the shrine, a crumbling monolith of blackened stone, slick with an unnatural sheen that seemed to pulse under the faint light of the storm-ridden sky. The air here was heavy, thick with the tang of iron and something far fouler, a cloying presence that prickled my skin and made my stomach churn. Elias and I stopped at the edge of the plateau, staring at the structure that loomed ahead. The wind howled around us, carrying whispers that seemed to swirl in and out of the edge of hearing, like forgotten voices crying out from the abyss. That's it, I said, my voice barely audible over the wind. The shrine. Elias tightened his grip on his sword, his face grim. This place stinks of chaos, he muttered. We shouldn't be here. We don't have a choice, I replied, stepping forward despite the weight of dread pressing against my chest. This is the only way. The shrine seemed to grow larger as we approached, its jagged edges rising like fangs from the cracked earth. Strange runes were carved into the stone, their shapes twisting and writhing as if alive. I forced myself to look away, my head pounding with the effort. The whispers grew louder with each step, forming words that slithered into my mind. Welcome, child of the pact. You have come far. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Did you hear that? I asked, glancing at Elias. He shook his head, his eyes scanning the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Hear what? The realization hit me like a blow. The voices weren't in the air, they were in me. We entered the shrine, the threshold marked by a jagged arch that seemed to radiate malice. Inside, the air was colder, damp and stifling, and the walls oozed with a dark ichor that dripped onto the floor in sluggish rivulets. The chamber was vast, lit only by the faint glow of corrupted symbols etched into the stone. At the center of the room stood a dais, and upon it was a figure, transparent and flickering like a dying flame. My breath caught as I realized what I was seeing. It was him. Baron Elta von Hohenstahl, I whispered. It looks like a decision has been reached. The figure turned, its face eerily familiar despite the centuries that separated us. His eyes were hollow, his once proud features twisted with anguish and despair. He regarded me with a mix of pity and recognition. Parzival, the vision said, his voice reverberating like a chorus of echoes. You bear the burden of our blood. I stepped forward, my heart pounding. Why? What did you do? Eltar's expression darkened. His gaze fell to the ground. I bargained for strength to protect our people, but their gifts are poisoned. The lands were saved, but at a cost. Our bloodline was bound to their will, and the taint passed from one generation to the next. I clenched my fists, the weight of his words threatening to crush me. Eltar's form flickered, his face a mask of sorrow. The artifact, he said. It lies within the Chaos Wastes, a shard of the Pact forged in blood and despair. Only by confronting it can the bond be severed. But beware, it will test you, and failure will mean more than death. The vision faded, leaving silence in its wake. I turned to Elias, my determination hardening. We have to find it, the artifact. Elias's face was pale, his jaw tight. Did you hear him? This thing isn't just dangerous, it's a trap. You walk into those wastes, you might not come back. And even if you do, you might not be you anymore. You might not be you anymore. I can't let this curse continue, I said, my voice firm. If I don't stop it, who will? It's my responsibility. He shook his head. No one can stop the curse, darling. Elias sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Lad, you don't owe the past anything. You're not him. Whatever choices Eltar made, they're not yours to pay for. I met his gaze, unflinching. No, but they've shaped my life, and the lives of everyone who came after him. I can't walk away from this, Elias. If there's even a chance to set things right, I have to take it. Elias shook his head, but I saw the resignation in his eyes. Fine, he muttered. But don't think for a second that I'll let you face this alone. We left the shrine, the whispers growing fainter as we descended the plateau. The Chaos Wastes loomed to the north, their jagged peaks and shifting horizons a nightmare made real. The artifact awaited us there, and with it, the truth of my bloodline's fate. As we sat out, I felt the weight of every choice I had made pressing down on me. The road ahead would be dangerous, perhaps fatal, but, for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope, as if I could face this darkness and survive, perhaps I could finally be free. Chapter 8. Into the Chaos Wastes. The Chaos Wastes were unlike anything I could have imagined, even in my darkest dreams. The land itself seemed alive, its contours shifting and writhing as if rejecting our presence. Colors bled into one another in impossible hues, the sky a swirling maelstrom of black, green, and violet. The air crackled with an unnatural energy, stinging my skin and filling my ears with a faint, insidious hum. Time felt meaningless here. The sun, if it still existed, refused to rise or set. Elias and I pressed forward, our boots sinking into earth that felt more like flesh than soil. Each step was an act of will, the oppressive atmosphere threatening to crush us under its weight. Strange shapes lurked in the distance, moving with purpose, but never drawing closer. The whispers in my mind grew louder with every mile. "You don't have to suffer, Parzival," they said, their voices as smooth and cold as silk. "The power is yours to claim. You are the blood of Hornstall, destined for greatness. Accept it." I shook my head, trying to banish the thoughts. But they lingered, clinging to the edges of my consciousness like cobwebs. "Stay focused, lad," Elias said, his voice hoarse. He hadn't spoken much since we entered the wastes, but his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, his sword always in hand. "This place preys on weakness. Don't let it in." I nodded, gripping my sword tightly. "I'm fine," I lied. The first attack came without warning. A warband of chaos warriors emerged from the mist, their twisted armor gleaming in the strange light. Their leader, a hulking brute with a horned helm and a blade that pulsed with a sickly glow, raised his weapon and roared a challenge. The sound seemed to ripple through the air, shaking the ground beneath our feet. "Run!" Elias shouted, but the warriors were already upon us. There was no time to think, only react. I parried the first strike, the force of the blow nearly knocking me off my feet. These were no ordinary soldiers. Their strength was unnatural, their movements impossibly fast. Elias fought like a man possessed, his blade flashing as he cut through one foe after another. I held my ground as best I could, but the whispers grew louder, drowning out the clash of steel. "You cannot win this way, Parzival," they murmured. "They will kill you, and your legacy will end here. Take the power. It is your birthright." "No!" I shouted, swinging wildly at the nearest warrior. My blade connected, but the effort left me exposed. Another warrior lunged at me, his axe poised to strike. I leapt aside, causing the warrior to miss with his axe. Before he could land the blow, Elias appeared, his sword slicing through the attacker's neck. He turned to me, blood streaming down his face. "Get it together, lad," he snapped. "They'll kill us both if you don't fight like you mean it." The battle ended as suddenly as it began. The surviving Chaos Warriors retreated into the mist, their leader bellowing promises of vengeance. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my sword. Elias stood over me, his breathing ragged. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice low. "You've got to shut out whatever's in your head, or it'll eat you alive." I nodded, but I couldn't meet his eyes. I drank from my goblet. The second attack came hours later, or maybe days. Time was impossible to track in the wastes. This time, it wasn't warriors, but something far worse. The demon emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and impossible to define. It moved like liquid, its limbs stretching and warping as it advanced. Its eyes burned with a malevolent light, and its voice filled my mind, stronger and clearer than before. "You cannot resist me, Parzival. Your blood belongs to me." The ground quaked as it spoke, and I stumbled backward, my fear paralyzing me. Elias stepped in front of me, his blade raised. "Stay behind me," he growled. The demon struck with impossible speed, its claws raking across Elias's chest. He staggered, but didn't fall, slashing at the creature with all his strength. The battle was a blur of motion, but it was clear he was losing. "No!" I shouted, rushing forward, but the demon swatted me aside like a child. I hit the ground hard, the air forced from my lungs. "What?" Elias turned to me, his face pale, blood pouring from his wounds. "Stay, Sham," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "No matter what it says, no matter what it promises." With a final, desperate cry, Elias drove his sword into the daemon's chest. The creature shrieked, its form unraveling into shadow and smoke. But Elias collapsed with it, his body falling limply to the ground. I crawled to his side, tears streaming down my face. "Elias," I choked, shaking him. "Don't go. Please." I tried to repress sobs, searching for the right words to express. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, and he managed a faint smile. "You're stronger than you think, lad," he whispered. "Prove me right." And then he was gone. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, cradling Elias's body as the wastes closed in around me. The whispers in my mind were deafening now, urging me to give in, to claim the power that was rightfully mine. But I remembered Elias's words, "Stay human." I rose to my feet, my grief and rage fueling my resolve. I wasn't done yet. The artifact awaited, and I would face whatever lay ahead. For Elias, for myself, for the chance to finally break the chains of my bloodline. Chapter 9. The Abyss of Choice. The artifact stood before me, jagged and black as midnight, pulsing with an unnatural light that seemed to throb in time with my heartbeat. It was embedded in a pedestal of twisted, corrupted stone, the air around it shimmering like heat haze. The whispers in my mind had grown deafening, a cacophony of voices urging, pleading, demanding. "Take it. You were meant for this. With this power, you can shape the world as you see fit." Now, I stepped closer, the pool of the shard almost irresistible. Its surface seemed to ripple like liquid obsidian, and the light within promised something more than power. It promised purpose, clarity, the end of all my doubts and fears. I extended a trembling hand, but as my fingers neared the shard, the air before me warped, and a figure materialized. The Daemon Prince was a towering monstrosity, its form a grotesque blend of regal and nightmarish. Wings of tattered flesh spread wide behind it, and its body shimmered with an ever-shifting array of colors. Its eyes, burning pits of gold and blue, locked onto mine with an intensity that froze me in place. "Parzival von Hohenstahl," it intoned, its voice echoing both in the air and within my mind. "You stand at the precipice of destiny. The pact forged by your ancestor is yours to fulfill. Take the shard and claim the power that is your birthright." I swallowed hard, my voice trembling. I didn't ask for this. I never wanted any of this. The daemon's lips curled into a cruel smile. "And yet, here you are. Every step you have taken has led you here, to this moment. Do not deny what you are." I felt the pull of the shard again, stronger this time, almost overwhelming. The voices whispered promises of greatness, of a world remade in my image. I could end the suffering I had witnessed. I could bring order to the chaos. I could become more than just a frightened noble, running from the shadows of my past. "I wish..." But then another voice cut through the noise, a memory, faint yet unwavering. "Stay human," Elias had said, his voice hoarse as he lay dying. "No matter what it says, no matter what it promises, do it. We need you to speak for us. Goodbye, Commander." And before that, Malric's words, "The blood doesn't make the man, it's the choices you make that matter." The demon's smile faltered, its gaze narrowing. They were fools, bound by their weakness and fear. You are not them. You are more. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. They were stronger than you'll ever understand, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. They sacrificed everything for me, not for power, not for glory, because they believed in something greater. The demon's expression twisted into a snarl. You think their sacrifice absolves you. You think their petty ideals will save you from the truth. The blood sings, Parzival. It calls to you because it is who you are. No, I said, stepping back from the shard. It's not who I am. My bloodline might be tainted, but I'm more than my past. I make my own choices. Draw your pretenses. Crescendo waits upon you. The demon roared, its form expanding as it loomed over me, its wings blocking out the faint light of the corrupted sky. You dare defy me? You dare defy your destiny? Pretending to be afraid, I reached out with my senses, feeling the terrifying edges of Belerium. I do, I said, drawing my sword. The blade felt insignificant against such a being, but the act of holding it steadied me. I reject this power. I reject you. The demon's roar shook the ground, but I stood firm. The artifact pulsed violently, its light intensifying until the entire shrine was bathed in an otherworldly glow. The voices in my mind screamed, a final desperate plea for me to relent. But I didn't. With a cry, I raised my sword and brought it down on the shard. The impact sent a shockwave through the air, the artifact shattering into 1,000 pieces that dissolved into ash. The light faded, and the whispers fell silent. The demon prince shrieked, its form unraveling, as if consumed by its own fury. You will regret this, Parzival von Hohenstahl, it hissed, as it faded into nothingness. The blood sings, and it will always sing. Silence fell over the shrine, broken only by the sound of my labored breathing. I sank to my knees, the weight of what I had done crashing over me. The shard was gone, the pact broken, or so I hoped. But the cost of this victory felt immeasurable. Elias's face flashed in my mind, his final words a reminder of the path I had chosen. I clenched my fists, my resolve hardening. I'll prove you right, Elias, I whispered. I'll prove that I'm more than my blood. With the shard destroyed and the shrine crumbling around me, I rose to my feet and turned toward the wastes. The journey back would be long and fraught with danger, but for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Trips there back were to be expensive, and I wanted nothing more than to creep back into Jimma's arms. The darkness within me hadn't won. I had chosen humanity over corruption, and I would keep making that choice, no matter how many times the blood sang. Chapter 10. Redemption or Damnation. Recovered from Falls, New Jersey. The moment my blade shattered the artifact, the world exploded into chaos. A wave of raw magical energy erupted from the shard, tearing through the shrine and sending me sprawling. The ground beneath my feet cracked and heaved, and the air was filled with an unearthly wail, an echo of the artifact's destruction, a final cry of defiance from the powers it once served. Did my work, the sorceress said with a wry smile. I barely had time to think before the stone beneath me gave way. The shrine collapsed in on itself, each jagged piece of stone and corrupted rune drawn into a vortex of light and shadow. The force of the blast hurled me into the air, and for a moment I was weightless, suspended between the collapsing shrine and the churning storm above. Then I fell. When I awoke, The world was silent. Lay in a shallow crater, the earth around me scorched and cracked, the very air humming with residual energy. The plateau was unrecognizable, the shrine reduced to a smoldering pit at its center. The jagged peaks of the chaos wastes in the distance seemed to bow toward the aftermath, their twisted shapes softened by the eerie stillness that followed the storm. Pain coursed through my body as I pushed myself upright. My hands were raw and blistered, the skin on my arms marred by burns that formed intricate, almost deliberate patterns. I caught my reflection in a pool of stagnant water nearby and froze. My face, though still mine, bore the marks of the ordeal. A scar ran from my temple to my jaw, stark and red against my pale skin. My eyes glinted with a strange intensity, as if touched by the remnants of the artifact's power. But they were still my eyes. Human eyes. I was alive. The whispers were gone. The incessant pull. The promises of power. The taunts of inevitability, all silenced. In their place was a hollow ache, a weight that settled deep in my chest. The blood of my ancestors still flowed within me, but I had proven that it did not define me. I stood slowly, the pain in my body a reminder of the price I had paid. Elias's face flashed in my mind, his voice urging me to stay human. Malric's sacrifice, the pilgrims I had saved, the villagers I had failed, all of them were etched into my memory, shaping the person I had become. I looked to the horizon, the faint outline of the empire barely visible through the haze. I couldn't return to the life I had left behind, not as the naive noble who had set out in search of purpose. That person no longer existed, but I could return as something else. The journey back was long and grueling, the waste still teeming with dangers I had to outwit or outrun. Each step felt heavier than the last, but the determination burning within me kept me moving forward. I wasn't walking away from the darkness. I was walking toward the light, carrying the scars of my choices with me. Through the night's front parlor window, St. Paul's stretched out his arms to the sky and let his twin personality. By the time I reached the empire's borders, the land had changed. Villages I remembered from my childhood were now little more than ashes, the remnants of war and raids leaving their mark. Refugees crowded the roads, their faces etched with despair. The world was as broken as I had left it, but I was no longer the same man who had abandoned it. I arrived in a town near the edge of the empire, a place too small for even a name on the maps. The people there whispered as I passed, their eyes drawn to the scars on my face, the burns on my arms, the weight I carried in my gaze. I ignored their stares. I wasn't there to win favor or admiration. My goal was simpler, to do what I could to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. End of Chapter 15. Recording by John Greenman. It started small. I helped rebuild a fence, shared what little knowledge I had of fighting when the village's defenders came to me for advice. I fought off a band of marauders with the same blade I had once wielded so clumsily. I didn't call myself a hero, and neither did they, but they looked at me with hope, and that was enough. I knew my path wouldn't end here. The darkness within me, the shadow of my bloodline, would never fully disappear. There would always be moments of doubt, moments when the temptation to succumb felt insurmountable. But I carried the memory of Elias's sacrifice, Malric's warning, and my own resolve to stand against it. As I prepared to leave the town, a child approached me, her small hand tugging at my tattered cloak. "Are you going to fight the monsters?" she asked, her voice trembling. I knelt to meet her gaze, offering a faint smile. "I'll fight them," I said, "for as long as I can." She nodded, her expression one of quiet determination, as if my words had steadied something in her. As I turned to the horizon, the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, casting the land in hues of gold and crimson. The empire was vast, its dangers unending, but I would walk its roads and face its horrors. Not as Parzival von Hohenstau, the naive noble. Carter, but as Parzival, the wanderer, scarred but resolute, weak but unwilling to break, a man defined not by his blood, but by his choices. And in that I found redemption.